Amina stepped into the crowded airport feeling the eyes of strangers on her bag and her movements. She clutched it tightly hoping no one would notice the small device tucked inside that could change everything. The air was thick with tension and whispers surrounded her as she moved toward security. She tried to calm her racing heart, but the tightening grip of fear refused to loosen. The officer at the front waved her forward, his eyes sharp and unreadable. Amina hesitated, her mind racing with every possible outcome as the line behind her grew impatient. She knew one wrong step could ruin everything. She stepped closer, and the officer leaned slightly closer and whispered something that sent a shiver down her spine, and she froze, waiting for what would come next. The conveyor belt hummed beneath her bag, and she placed it down, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The X-ray machine whirred and flashed, revealing the shapes inside, and she saw the faces of the officers tighten and exchange glances. She felt a cold finger of panic slide down her spine as one officer pointed at her bag and motioned for her to open it. Her voice caught in her throat as she tried to speak, but nothing came out. She watched as her carefully packed belongings were pulled out one by one: papers, electronics, small gadgets, and the small prototype that had taken months of work to perfect. She tried to explain that it was harmless, that it was her brother's invention, but the words seemed useless against the strict procedures. The officer frowned and called for another to assist him. Her bag was turned upside down, items spilling onto the table, and the crowd around them pressed closer, eyes watching every movement. She felt exposed and vulnerable. The whispers of suspicion grew louder in her ears, and she struggled to maintain her composure. She saw the officer lean back and glance at the others, then his eyes met hers, and he whispered again so softly that only she could hear the words, "Stand down." She blinked, confused, and a rush of relief mingled with fear washed over her. The others around them paused, uncertain what the command meant, and tension thickened in the air like a storm about to break. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she knew that everything could change in a single moment. She took a shallow breath and waited for the officer to make the next move, unsure if it would bring salvation or disaster, and the airport seemed to hold its breath with her as the moment stretched longer than she thought possible, leaving a shadow of suspense that clung to her every thought and action. The officers hesitated as Amina stared at the one who whispered, "Stand down," her hands still hovering over the scattered contents of her bag. The device that had caused all the suspicion lay half exposed on the metal table, its wires and small panels glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. She felt a strange mix of fear and hope as the officer stepped closer and motioned for the others to pause. The crowd around them murmured quietly, unaware of the subtle tension that hung like a fragile thread above the scene. Amina tried to explain the device, its purpose and origin, her voice shaking as she spoke, but protocol seemed deaf to her words, and one officer frowned deeply, insisting they continue the search. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of judgment pressing down on her every move. The whispering officer leaned in closer and murmured again, "Stand down," his eyes locking with hers, conveying a silent promise that he understood the truth. A flicker of relief passed through her chest, but uncertainty still clung to her. The others glanced at him suspiciously, unsure why he would intervene without explanation. She watched as he carefully picked up the device, examining it with a practiced eye, his fingers moving deftly but with caution. He recognized instantly that it was harmless, a prototype for a school science competition, yet outwardly it looked dangerous enough to set off alarms. The tension in the room was like a taut wire ready to snap. Every second stretched longer as the other officers debated whether to proceed. Amina felt the heat rise in her face from the embarrassment and fear. The crowd seemed oblivious to the storm swirling around her bag. She noticed a small child staring wide-eyed at the chaos, the mother trying to shield her gaze. A bead of sweat slid down Amina's temple as she realized how fragile the situation was. One wrong gesture, one misunderstood action could escalate everything in an instant. She took a shaky breath and tried to steady herself. The officer whispered one more time, "Stand down," and gave a subtle nod to the senior officer, who hesitated mid-movement. The tension crackled through the air like static electricity. Amina felt a shiver run down her spine as she waited for the response, every eye now on the device and the man who held the quiet authority. The murmurs of passengers grew louder, and the airport itself seemed to hold its breath. She could almost feel the seconds stretching like hours, and the uncertainty gnawed at her until she knew nothing could resolve this moment completely until the next move was made, and all she could do was watch and wait for what would come next, leaving the reader unsure whether relief or disaster would strike in the next heartbeat. Detective Harris held the small device carefully, his eyes scanning every detail as if the truth was written in its wires and panels. He had seen enough to know that panic often disguised innocence, yet the officers around him were still tense, voices rising in quiet disagreement, while Amina stood frozen, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though it could anchor her to safety. The whispers of "Stand down" echoed in her mind like a fragile promise, but doubt still gnawed at She watched Harris glance at the senior officer whose eyes flickered with frustration yet curiosity. The tension between authority and judgment hung in the air. Heavy and suffocating passengers shuffled anxiously, but none understood the silent battle taking place over a small bag and its mysterious contents. Harris spoke softly to himself, almost inaudibly, noting the harmless nature of the device, a prototype for a science competition designed by Amina and her brother, months of work culminating in this single moment. He knew the explanation would not satisfy everyone, and that protocol demanded caution, yet instinct told him to protect the young woman from unnecessary humiliation. He leaned slightly closer to Amina, his gaze reassuring yet still serious. "Stand down," he whispered again, a simple command layered with meaning. She nodded, subtly trying to mask the tremor in her body. The other officers exchanged looks and whispered amongst themselves. One of them reached out, uncertain whether to trust Harris or follow standard procedure. A bead of sweat slid down Amina's cheek, her stomach twisted with anxiety. She could not predict the outcome, and yet she had to remain composed as Harris examined the device further, checking its circuits and switches, every motion careful, deliberate, calculated to avoid alarm. He noticed small labels and sketches that proved it was indeed a harmless invention, yet outward appearances were deceiving. He knew that one hasty assumption could ruin everything. He felt the weight of responsibility settle like a stone in his chest, and the room seemed to shrink around the tense triangle of him, Amina, and the senior officer. He whispered, "Stand down," once more, almost like a chant, each repetition a lifeline pulling her back from the edge of despair. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady herself. The murmurs of passengers faded into background noise as her focus narrowed to Harris and the device in his hands. Suspense coiled tightly around the moment, leaving every reader wondering, would the officers finally listen, or would Amina face humiliation and chaos? Despite her innocence, the seconds dragged as if time itself hesitated, waiting for the next action to either release her or plunge her deeper into uncertainty. A shiver ran through her body as she realized the next decision could define everything, and the room hung on the precipice of revelation, leaving the story suspended on the edge of what would happen next. Amina's hands trembled as she watched the other officers hesitate, unsure whether to proceed, their eyes flicking between the device and Detective Harris, who stood calm and resolute. Her chest tightened with every passing second. She felt exposed, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The conveyor belt hummed quietly beneath her bag, now partially restored to order, but still the center of attention. The murmurs of the crowd seemed distant to her, as if she were trapped inside a bubble of tension and fear. One officer stepped forward, reaching for the device, but Harris's hand shot out in a subtle motion, stopping him mid-action. "Stand down," he whispered, low and deliberate, and the room froze. The senior officer paused, unsure how to react, his brows knitted in uncertainty. Harris did not break eye contact with Amina, offering her a small, reassuring nod, yet the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on both of them. The small device looked harmless to those who could see it plainly, but to the untrained eye it carried the marks of potential danger. The whispers of concern and suspicion rippled through the crowd, passengers leaning forward, craning their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of what caused the commotion. Amina swallowed hard, her throat dry, and her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She tried to maintain a calm facade, though inside panic surged through her. Every instinct screamed that one wrong word or gesture could undo the fragile safety Harris maintained. He carefully examined the wires, the labels, the small sketches, noting their precision and harmless intent. His voice was steady when he spoke to the other officers, quietly explaining the purpose of the device, yet even his words were tempered by caution, for authority and protocol could not be ignored entirely. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog. The airport seemed to pulse with every second, as if aware of the delicate balance teetering between order and chaos. Amina took a shallow breath, the warmth of relief brushing her face for a brief moment before anxiety returned in full force. She could not predict what would happen if any officer acted hastily. The device lay there like a tiny island of truth in a sea of misunderstanding. Harris whispered again, "Stand down," almost a command and almost a prayer. She felt the weight of his faith in her presence as a shield, yet the lingering fear made it impossible to relax completely. The passengers held their collective breath, and Amina's gaze flicked nervously to the others around her, waiting for a signal, a hint, a gesture that would indicate safety or disaster, and the suspense stretched endlessly, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next and whether the tension would finally break in her favor or crash down with devastating force. Amina's mind drifted back to the hours she had spent perfecting the device, the nights hunched over sketches and wires, the endless trial and error, the quiet encouragement from her brother who had believed in her when no one else did. She remembered the first prototype failing spectacularly, the sparks and smoke that had filled their tiny apartment, and the laughter that had followed, turning frustration into determination. Now all of that effort hung in the balance on a cold metal table in the middle of the airport with strangers watching her every move. Her heart ached with the thought that months of work could be dismissed in a single moment of misunderstanding. Yet she forced herself to breathe slowly, to center herself as Detective Harris continued his careful examination, his fingers precise and deliberate, avoiding any sudden movements. He understood instinctively the fragility of the situation. The other officers still watched, tensely debating quietly amongst themselves, their voices low but their body language revealing uncertainty. Harris whispered, "Stand down," once more, almost inaudibly, but with enough authority that Amina felt a strange surge of calm ripple through her. Despite the tension, she could see the device in his hands, and for the first time she felt that someone believed in her. She tried to speak, but the words lodged in her throat. As she realized that any explanation could be misinterpreted, he gave her a reassuring nod, and she understood that she must remain still and composed. The crowd pressed closer, some curious, some judgmental, some unaware of the true stakes. Her fingers brushed against a small notebook in her bag, the one with detailed notes and schematics. Her life poured onto pages and wires and circuits, and she hoped that Harris's intervention would be enough to prevent disaster. The senior officer finally leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, the debate hanging between caution and reason, stretched, the tension taut as a wire ready to snap. Harris did not flinch. He simply whispered again, "Stand down," and slowly the senior officer's shoulders relaxed just slightly, as if weighing the truth against protocol and deciding which to honor. Amina's chest tightened with hope, yet the lingering fear remained a shadow over her thoughts. She could hear her own heartbeat, and the faint murmurs of passengers, the hum of the conveyor belt, the rustle of papers, all blending into a chorus of suspense that refused to let go. She glanced at Harris one last time and saw a flicker of understanding and assurance in his eyes. She knew that what happened next would define not only her day but perhaps the culmination of all her efforts, and the silence before the next action felt like the world itself paused, leaving the reader suspended on the knife edge of anticipation, uncertain whether relief or catastrophe would strike in the next heartbeat. The senior officer's gaze shifted nervously between Harris and the device. Amina's bag, now partially restored on the conveyor belt, her belongings still scattered yet somehow contained by the careful hands of the detective. She felt every eye on her like a weight pressing down, and the air seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension, every second stretching longer than the one before. She tried to control her breathing, slow and steady, but her pulse throbbed in her temples as if announcing her fear to the entire terminal. Harris's hands moved with meticulous care, examining the wires, the tiny circuits, the sketches and labels that revealed the harmless purpose of the device. He whispered, "Stand down," once more, his voice low, and measured, a quiet command and a shield at once. Amina's heart leapt with cautious hope, but the uncertainty of the others still made her stomach twist. One officer reached out cautiously towards the device, but Harris's subtle motion stopped him mid-movement, his eyes meeting Amina's. In a brief exchange of silent reassurance, the murmurs of the crowd seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the tension that coiled tightly around the scene like a living thing. The senior officer's brows knitted as he weighed the situation against protocol, against reason, against the potential for disaster, every movement deliberate, calculated. Yet the suspense stretched endlessly through the terminal. Amina's mind raced back to the countless nights spent perfecting the prototype, the failures, the sparks, the laughter, the quiet encouragement of her brother, the triumphs and setbacks, all laid bare on the cold metal table, and she prayed that Harris's judgment would be enough to protect her from unnecessary humiliation, from the misinterpretation of her work. The other officers glanced at each other, uncertainty flashing in their eyes, the device harmless yet misunderstood, a small invention yet the center of attention. Harris finally spoke softly to them, explaining the purpose, the context, the harmless nature of the object, and still the weight of authority and procedure made the room feel like a pressure cooker, every pause a threat, every breath a countdown to possible disaster. Amina's fingers trembled as she clutched the edge of the table, her bag and its contents a lifeline to everything she had worked for. She caught sight of a small child watching curiously from nearby and felt a pang of vulnerability and hope. The terminal itself seemed to hold its breath, the hum of machinery, the soft shuffle of passengers, the distant announcements, all blending into a tense symphony of anticipation, and the quiet repetition of "Stand down" became a mantra of survival, of understanding, of faith in Harris's judgment, leaving the reader suspended on the edge, uncertain if the next move would bring relief or send everything spiraling into chaos, with only the tiniest flicker of movement determining the outcome. The terminal seemed to shrink around Amina as every eye remained fixed on the small device and the man who held the quiet authority over its fate. She felt her chest tighten with each passing second, and the scattered belongings of her bag seemed almost to mock her months of preparation and hard work. Detective Harris's hands hovered carefully over the device, tracing its edges and circuits like a silent guardian. He whispered, "Stand down" again, a low, steady command that vibrated through the tension. In the air, Amina tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of his voice as a lifeline, her pulse pounding in sync with the unspoken suspense around her. The senior officer's gaze flicked nervously between Harris and the device, weighing rules against reason, each second stretching longer than the last. One of the assisting officers swallowed hard and glanced around the terminal, feeling the silent pressure of the waiting crowd. Their murmurs, a soft undertone of expectation, the possibility of disaster hung like a shadow over everyone present. Amina's thoughts drifted again to her brother, and the nights they had spent hunched over wires and sketches, the triumphs and failures, the sparks and laughter that had defined their journey, all condensed into this single moment that could undo everything in an instant. Harris's fingers moved with deliberate precision, ensuring that nothing about the device suggested threat, yet the outward appearance of complexity and the unfamiliarity to the untrained eye maintained the tension. He whispered, "Stand down," once more, almost like a prayer for calm, for understanding, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the reaction of the other officers. Amina's throat felt dry as she watched the senior officer's shoulders tense. He leaned forward slightly, uncertainty warring with reason. Harris's eyes never left hers, a subtle nod of reassurance passing between them, a quiet promise that he would protect her from the consequences of misunderstanding the device. Harmless yet pivotal, her bag, still sprawled with paper, sketches, and gadgets, lay vulnerable in the middle of the terminal, a symbol of both innocence and anxiety. She tried to steady her shaking hands, the hum of the conveyor belt, the shuffle of passengers, the soft, distant announcements, all blending into a tense symphony of anticipation, the murmurs of judgment and curiosity growing faint as all attention focused on the silent negotiation of authority and intuition. One of the junior officers hesitated halfway through a gesture to continue the search. Harris's subtle movement stopped him, and the quiet repetition of "stand down" echoed through the space, a mantra of patience and trust, and the suspense clung to every word, every glance, leaving the reader hanging on the precipice, uncertain whether the fragile calm would hold or if the next heartbeat would unleash chaos and humiliation for Amina and the device that had become the center of an invisible storm. Amina's breath caught as Detective Harris slowly lifted the device, turning it gently in his hands, examining every wire and panel with meticulous care. He whispered, "Stand down," once more, almost like a command, and almost like a shield protecting her from the judgment of others around them. The senior officer's brow furrowed, uncertain whether to trust the instinct and knowledge of the detective or to follow the rigid rules of protocol. The tension hung thick in the air, a living thing pressing down on everyone present, passengers shifting uneasily, murmuring quietly among themselves, unaware of the delicate balance between authority and reason. Amina felt a tremor run through her body, her fingers brushing against her bag, her mind recalling the nights spent perfecting the prototype, the sparks, the sketches, the endless trial and error, the quiet encouragement of her brother, the laughter and frustration, all condensed into this single moment that could decide the outcome of everything. Harris's eyes met hers for a brief second, and a flicker of reassurance passed silently between them. She tried to focus on that flicker, the only tether keeping her grounded, as the others debated quietly, their voices low but tense. The subtle repetition of "stand down" echoed in her mind, a mantra of patience, trust, and understanding. The senior officer finally shifted slightly, his shoulders relaxing minutely. The decision seemed to hang in the air like a breath suspended, waiting for the release of reason to outweigh fear. Harris carefully demonstrated the harmless function of the device, showing the small mechanisms moving exactly as intended. Amina watched with bated breath, her stomach twisting with suspense and hope. The murmurs of the crowd faded into the background, leaving only the hum of machinery, the rustle of papers, and the quiet tension that coiled around the space like a living thing. She could feel the seconds stretching endlessly, each one a delicate thread holding the fragile calm together. One wrong gesture, one misstep could undo everything. She clenched her fists slightly, trying to steady herself. Harris whispered, "Stand down" again, his voice soft yet firm, a signal that the moment was under control for now. The other officers leaned closer, their eyes narrowing as they examined the device through the lens of caution and curiosity. Slowly the realization began to spread across their faces that the device was indeed harmless, that it was a prototype for a science competition created by a young woman whose months of effort and ingenuity were evident in every detail. Amina felt a flutter of relief mingle with lingering anxiety. The suspense hung like a thin veil over the terminal, waiting to be lifted only when everyone acknowledged the truth, leaving the reader tense and eager to see whether the calm would finally hold or whether a single misstep could reignite the storm surrounding her bag and the small invention that had become the center of it all. Amina's shoulders loosened slightly as the tension began to shift in the terminal, the officers around her still cautious but gradually accepting Harris's judgment. The small device, now fully understood to be harmless, rested gently on the table, yet the memory of fear and suspicion lingered like a shadow. She watched the senior officer finally nod, subtly signaling the others to step back, and the crowd of passengers slowly resumed their normal movements, their whispers fading into the background, but Amina could still feel their eyes on her, as if some part of the danger had followed her. Harris remained close, his gaze sharp and steady, a silent promise that nothing would go wrong. At this moment, her bag carefully gathered and restored, she felt the weight of relief pressing against her chest, mingled with a lingering trace of anxiety that would not fully release her yet. She took a shaky breath and tried to focus on the quiet reassurance of his presence. The murmurs of curiosity from nearby passengers continued in soft waves, some asking quietly what had happened, others staring with wide eyes. Amina's mind replayed the sequence of events over and over, the fear, humiliation, near collapse, and then the quiet intervention that had saved her from both. Harris whispering, "Stand down," at the right moments, guiding her and the officers toward reason, a small miracle of intuition against protocol. Her fingers brushed against her bag, feeling the sketches, the small notebook, and the tiny device, a tangible reminder of her months of effort. The lights of the terminal seemed softer now as the adrenaline that had gripped her slowly began to ebb. She glanced at Harris one last time and saw the subtle nod of approval, the silent acknowledgement that she had survived the ordeal and that her work had been respected even in the face of misunderstanding. The other officers began to move away, returning to their duties, their expressions thoughtful, some exchanging quiet words, still processing what had happened around them. The passengers slowly resumed their routines, leaving Amina with a lingering sense of scrutiny mixed with relief. The small device that had caused so much suspicion now lay harmless and safe in her bag, yet the memory of tension, the whispers, the fear of misjudgment remained a vivid shadow. She realized that moments of understanding and discretion could change outcomes dramatically, that one person who chose to see beyond appearances could alter the course of events entirely. Harris whispered, "Stand down," one final time softly under his breath, and Amina felt the quiet closure settle over her. She straightened her shoulders and stepped back from the table, the suspense that had gripped the terminal finally beginning to dissolve, yet leaving a subtle echo of vigilance and uncertainty in the air, a reminder that calm could be fragile, and that every decision carried weight, leaving the reader waiting to see how the aftermath of this delicate encounter would unfold for both Amina and the quiet guardian who had protected her. Amina moved away from the table, her bag secured against her side, the weight of relief mingling with a cautious wariness that refused to leave her entirely. She glanced around the terminal, the passengers returning to their routines, the hum of machinery, the distant announcements, the shuffle of feet, all blending into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and charged with the memory of what had just passed. Harris walked slightly behind her, his presence a silent shield. She could feel the authority and calm that had guided her through the ordeal lingering in the air like a protective veil. She remembered the countless nights spent with her brother, the sparks and failures, the sketches and calculations, the tiny device that had become both a symbol of her work and a catalyst for suspicion and fear, now resting harmlessly in her bag. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The senior officer had returned to his duties, his expression thoughtful but neutral, the other officers moving about as if nothing had happened. Yet Amina could feel the invisible tension that had gripped the terminal slowly dissipating but never fully gone. The whispers of the crowd faded, but the memory of eyes on her remained, a ghostly reminder of vulnerability and scrutiny. She walked past the small cluster of passengers who had lingered curious about the incident. A few nodded politely, acknowledging the resolution of the moment, yet others stared silently as if sensing the gravity of what had almost occurred. Harris finally spoke softly, a low whisper, "Stand down," and Amina felt the words echo in her mind, a reminder of the delicate balance between vigilance and understanding, between fear and reason. The device in her bag, a small invention, yet a testament to persistence and ingenuity, now carried with it the weight of survival and recognition. She thought of her brother and the pride that he would feel knowing that her work had endured scrutiny and suspicion and emerged intact. The terminal seemed to breathe with her as she stepped toward the exit, the soft hum of engines, the rolling of suitcases, the quiet chatter of travelers, all blending into a rhythm that felt ordinary, yet beneath it lingered the memory of a moment when authority, discretion, and intuition had intersected to prevent disaster. Amina smiled faintly, her pulse slowing, her steps steadying. She realized that moments of courage and understanding could ripple outward, changing outcomes profoundly and quietly. The suspense of fear had dissolved into relief, yet left a lasting impression that would guide her in the future. The terminal faded behind her, the sunlight streaming through large windows warming her face. She felt a quiet sense of closure and gratitude, knowing that despite the uncertainty, the intervention had preserved not only her device but her dignity, and the silent whisper of "Stand down" lingered in her mind, a reminder that judgment, tempered with compassion, could alter lives, leaving the reader with a lingering sense of awe and relief, and the quiet knowledge that moments of understanding could triumph over chaos.